Hello, and welcome to Cybersecurity Hot Takes. This is your producer, Joshua, once again filling in for the amazing and incomparable Reece Guida. May she return soon. And with me on the left side of my screen, I have... You don't know who's on the left. Just pick.
We have no idea. I'm going to go with HB. He's on the left side of your screen.
He is on the left side of my screen.
Well, in that case, I'm HB, and I do product strategy here at Beyond Identity.
Yes, you do. And on the right side of my screen, I have...
I guess that leaves me. I'm Jasson Casey. I'm the CTO here.
Exactly. Welcome, everyone. And for today's cybersecurity hot take, will the A in RSA be replaced with AI? Jasson Casey was recently at the RSA Conference, as many of our audience was also, and there were a lot of hot topics and a lot of kind of the same conversations going on. And so he's going to fill us in on what some of those were, and we are going to discuss them. Jasson, how was RSA?
So good show. The level of people there was probably the same level as 2020 before COVID or the zombie apocalypse shut the world down. So that was interesting. As is my experience from before, RSA is generally it's a very mixed show, right? You spend a lot of time with partner companies, not just prospects and customers. But I think it was good all around. Thematically, the stuff that was on the floor, clearly AI's big theme, right? It's hastily stenciled in paint and toothpaste on everyone's signage. Other big themes that seem to be consistent: attack surface attack surface mapping or attack surface management. It seems like I only saw a few deception companies a while back. It seemed like everyone had a deception thing. MDR, ITDR, XDR. Basically, if you had an R, it was a big deal, and lots of people were putting R's at the end. Honestly, I didn't see a lot of new novel things in my mind. The only thing that I can say that really stands out as interesting and novel, and I don't know if it's fair because I kind of ran into them before RSA, was kind of an enterprise secure browser, which was really, really interesting. There's a couple people in the space, but the company I ran into is called Talon Security. But yeah, overall it was a good show. It was worth going to, at least for me and our group.
That's awesome. Wish I could have gone, but maybe next year. There's always next year, So when it comes to, kind of seeing so many of these people talk about the same things, which ones do you think were like either could you see being the most impactful, I guess is the question. Like, which one do you think any of them really had any staying power to like change this landscape as we know it, or...
Well, that's just it. Like, I think that a lot of the categories are categories that existed for a while, right? XDR, sure. MDR are natural evolutions, I think, of just EDR and kind of more modern antivirus. So anyone coming into that space, how in the world are you going to compete against the big players that are kind of already there, right? Whether it's the recent adults like CrowdStrike and SentinelOne, or the graybeards like Palo and whatnot. Like that's the tricky thing, right? Like, how do you go in as anything other than a feature that they may just kind of buy? I guess I forgot the theme on zero trust. Clearly, a lot of people were talking about zero trust. The reaction that I got from a lot of customers on zero trust really falls into one of two buckets. One set of customers prospects is burnt out on the word because, much like AI of this year, it's a hastily appended phrase that generates organic search metrics for marketing. Maybe that's too cynical, but certainly a large group of the market's kind of burned out and saying you're zero trust because they've heard everyone say they're zero trust.
Sure.
But I did have a lot of really interesting discussions with a bunch of CISOs that really just boiled down to, at the end of the day, if you really want to make progress on prevention, right, not just detection and response, you kind of have to break down these siloed walls between identity, device trust, and device identity. And traditionally we have these silos, right, for identity, for endpoint security, endpoint trust, endpoint configuration management, and they only kind of join, or the information between those systems only comes together at the detection and response phase, generally through a SIEM and SIEM analytics, maybe some other ways as well. But if you start to organize your thinking, and if you can somehow break down the walls from this vertical organization to a horizontal organization, right? If I join device and user identity, if I join device trust, really all three of those things, and make those access context or access concerns, and I want to make decisions about access using that information, then I'm kind of moving the needle out of detection and response and into more prevention. And almost all of my conversations really kind of centered around that. Now, granted, that might be a self-selection bias as well, given that's kind of what we do.
Sure.
But that was certainly some of the more interesting conversations I had.
Were a lot of people more comfortable with their zero trust strategies and what they were specifically looking for? Because I know that user and device trust hasn't typically been sort of central to the conversation in these kind of like conference settings.
I think obviously everything's a life cycle. Customers are no different, right? So different enterprises are at different phases of their own kind of maturity and growth. There are people that are far into the curve. They know exactly what they want. They've been working with zero trust concepts before zero trust was a marketing term. And I think a good example there would be, well, actually, I don't know if I can really name names on some of these things, but there were a couple CISOs that we spent time with where they knew exactly what they wanted. In their words, they called it device trust and device identity, and linking that to user identity. And they had been asking for this for a while from their CASB providers. But their CASB providers couldn't wrap their heads really around what the customer was asking for. And it's fundamentally different than kind of a CASB approach anyway. And so very, very articulate, knew exactly kind of the crux of the problem. Then you've got people mid-journey where they know it's important, they know they need to get involved, but they don't really understand, or they don't have their own strategy in place. Like, what's the first step for them in a zero trust journey? And then I'd say there's the third group, which is, maybe just earlier in the education side.
So a lot of it was anchored on people who previously had been hoping for this to come from CASBs, from cloud access security brokers.
One dinner, I spent quite a bit of time with a CISO on that particular topic.
And I was just surprised because I haven't heard CASBs talked about in a favorable tone in quite a few years now. So I was kind of
curious. in his mind, it had to do with footprint, right? So where does it make sense? Which honestly, kind of how we got here as well, right? Where does it make sense to place certain, network functions or system functions? And if I already have footprint established, right, in the point in cloud, clearly it's best if I can establish those functions in that existing footprint, right? Who wants to manage a bazillion agents? Who wants to manage a bazillion different services? So I think that's kind of what brought him to that point. He had a good relationship with his CASB vendor. He saw them as kind of leading the area, and he was just kind of asking them kind of why not.
So does that mean that he's still seeing himself as being a CASB user just via a SASE or SSE, and now he's just understanding that the SASE platforms and the SSE platforms need external support from an identity solution to be able to serve user and device trust?
So, the conversation went all over, but I would say in his mind, at the end of the day, his focus is less on checking the box for all the acronymed products and more on, can he definitively say that for all access, he actually understands the risk of the device, the identity of the device, the identity of the person relative to what they're trying to do. And it doesn't require, that solution, everything doesn't have to be microsegmentation for that problem, right? Everything doesn't have to be SASE for that problem. So I think he was much more kind of results driven, and the tools necessary for various parts of his workforce would be what was brought to bear. It wasn't kind of like he had his bingo card where he was trying to check off the 6 steps of SASE as prescribed by product marketing.
So most importantly, how did he want us to shoehorn GPT into the equation?
We didn't actually that night we didn't talk GPT at all. We didn't talk AI at all. I know. I certainly feel burnt out a little bit on the topic from a marketing and tech bro pump perspective. It's an interesting technology and it certainly has its applied uses, but Chat GPT and large language models don't solve all problems. They solve a couple of problems. And anyway, that wasn't a large topic of discussion.
It reminds me a little bit about like quantum computer hype over time. That like people just imagine that a quantum computer is also like magically a classical computer.
Shoot, you know what? I totally forgot. There was a standout at RSA.
Uh-oh.
And it's a good thing I don't remember their name because it's not what I have to say is not good.
Oh no.
They were advertising themselves as post-quantum resilient. It's like, oh, cool, post-quantum resilient software. That it's a real thing, right? NIST is working on certifying these post-quantum or quantum-resistant algorithms. Maybe it's like a library company, right? So we clearly need to be up to date and be algorithm agile and know all these players. Let me go talk to them. And so they started it off was like, well, our approach is really kind of based on symmetric encryption and whatnot, because like with good key and good pseudo random number generators and whatnot, you can with things like a strong AES, like you actually can have quantum resilient functions. And in the back of my mind, this kind of made sense, right? Like one-time pads and are perfectly secure and whatnot. And but then the obvious question then becomes, well, the whole thing with a symmetric algorithm is you need the same key on both sides. So it kind of begs the key distribution problem, right? Like, how do I generate a key and pass it, or how do I synchronize on something securely that then generates the same keys, right? What the problems are probably reducible to each other. Again, like I'm not actually a cryptographer. But I know a few, therefore I'm dangerous. It's like the Holiday Inn defense. But he started going on about how, well, that's their secret sauce. And that's really where they cut their mustard. And it's like, oh, cool. I've got a really long flight on Friday. Can you point me to a couple of the academic papers that this is based on? I'd love to read it on my flight home. And that is where I realized I was kind of talking to essentially a bullshit company. And so to the best of my knowledge, they're doing some sort of seed they have some sort of consensus algorithm that achieves synchronization on a seed value that they use to kind of seed symmetric generators that then generate the same key on both sides.
And speak algorithms are well established in the space. So like, I think your question to ask for some sort of academic provenance seems reasonable.
Well, and so honestly, what sent up my spidey senses when I asked him for the papers is like, well, it's a proprietary algorithm. We don't actually talk about how we do that. And it's like, oh, I get it. That's the kind of company you are.
Even with open spake and speak algorithms, like I remember when I was at Aruba, there was a whole bunch of controversy around Dragonfly. You get like within 50 yards of a NIST person while working on any of this stuff, and all of a sudden you're a government agent. But
well, I mean, here's the thing, right? Like, and we're all taught this in like the first class we ever take in this world is at least related to security is like keeping a thing secret, keeping the algorithm secret is not a defense. This is an area that does involve actual mathematics and a level of rigor far beyond what I can do. But like, it's a real discipline. It's a real specialty. People spend decades of their life just getting to the point of being able to do the work. and they even make mistakes, right? So like the reason we trust the algorithms that we do that underlying cryptography is not just because the how has been published, but because it's been reviewed, and in some cases it's actually been proven in like mechanical kind of theorem proving ways, and in other circumstances it's just stood the test of time, right? And so short of being able to answer do one-way functions exist, right? Or is P equal to NP? Like it's really, really hard to know that you have a secure system, or you have a system that truly is resistant to a Turing machine in a reasonable amount of time, or to a quantum Turing machine. And the idea that a company is selling a product based on kind of hiding the algorithm is comical.
Yeah, I can imagine. So, but yeah, so like, I think that goes back to that whole idea that when people start talking quantum or AI, or back in the day before LLM, NLP, and natural language processing, like there's just a lot of washing that goes on where people are just applying it to everything and anything and just making shit up. The interesting thing on the AI side, though, that you brought up was the types of problems that it solves, similar to sort of how quantum solves, like, problems that are in a quantum domain, and within a narrow set, there's an appropriateness. This whole AI ops situation, you were saying that some of the work from like folks like Palantir seemed interesting, but that it was isolated to certain use cases. Could you sort of explain that?
Yeah. So I think it was Nelson shared a video from Palantir, and they were showcasing kind of their applied use of LLMs as well as some other techniques in kind of a warfighter kind of DoD military sort of mode. And without getting into all the specifics at a high level, there's an incredible amount of information being surfaced to both kind of the soldier, right, in the field, as well as the combatant commander who's not in the field. And so what they're doing, or at least what they were illustrating, is how do they use LLMs and other techniques to basically process all of this information, summarize it, and produce kind of actionable readouts in a way that makes sense and is much, much more efficient than having kind of a ton of human analysts do the same amount of work. And number one, it was fascinating to watch. Like it honestly reminded me of kind of the old multiplayer. I forget what MUD even stands for now, but when we used to do the text-based MUDs back in the 90s, it's like turn left. Do you see a light? Do you see a door? Open the door. Because it was a free text interface to essentially interact with your data. It was kind of like your AI assistant who's synthesizing all the data and giving you summaries, and then you're saying, give me a course of action, or give me a couple courses of action, and give me the analysis on those actions, and then I'll choose one. A couple things immediately popped up. Number one, like LLMs are not smart. LLMs are models that are trained on data sets. So they clearly inherit the error of the data. They clearly inherit the bias of the data, right? So that was kind of what I was getting at in terms of you really kind of have to understand how the data was trained to begin with. But it also reminded me a little bit of kind of my days when I was at a company called Security Scorecard. And we had a similar problem. We were producing an incredible amount of data by essentially assets connected to the internet, both passive and active. And we had to try and make sense of that to understand, what's going on inside of an organization, what likely belongs to an organization. And inherently, you're going to have error in this data, right? Like these aren't perfect models because there's no discrete or deterministic system you're modeling off of. But at the end of the day, if I'm producing 1,000 data points that suggest a course of action and I have 10% of error, that means 100 data points are wrong, right? And 9,000 data points are still suggesting that course of action, right? Like it's still worth the course of action. Or put another way, if I have a team of analysts that can't handle the deluge of data that's being dumped on them, and they really want to focus on what's going to be the most impactful or what's going to represent the most amount of risk for them to dig into, a probabilistic solution that comes with error is still going to make their outcomes better. Now, clearly, you have to understand that error and track that error. But even in the case that I just outlined, right, those 5 analysts are able to chew through much more information that's pertinent to their company, that represents an outsized risk impact than them kind of being able to make the decisions on their own. So there's absolute applicability. But again, these things, they're models. We shouldn't treat them any differently than we treat a curve that we fitted to some data points in class. It's a more sophisticated version of that. They're not intelligent, but they do help us synthesize a vast amount of data quickly under a quantified amount of error.
So there are uses in like the AI ops space and everything that people are looking at, but it's not the panacea that people are making it out to be at the moment.
Well, it's kind of like Zero Trust 2 years ago, right? Like if 90% of the booths in RSA have AI written on them, what is the meaning of writing AI on the booth, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that some of them aren't true, and that doesn't mean that some of them don't have applicability. But RSA is kind of a noisy event, right?
Sure.
Like there literally felt like there was a carnival barker a couple rows away from us at one point. There was this one booth where someone's got a microphone and they're trying to give this talk, and 90 degrees adjacent from the woman giving the talk was some sort of game like Simon, right? Touch the colors as they light up with all sorts of.
I saw that. It looked very fun.
And he was playing the game really aggressively while literally 4 feet away from him, this woman was trying to give this talk. And it's just madness. It's a madhouse. And this is what I mean by like the noise floor is high.
Mm-hmm. Nice. I'm going to be forever imprinted with that image. It's like when you used to see people playing Dance Dance Revolution with a little bit too much zeal at an arcade.
It was exactly like that. Yeah. I saw videos of that game, and you are exactly on the money on that.
Maybe it was just, you know what, guys, this is Thursday of RSA. I don't care anymore. I'm going to do whatever. Maybe that's what I'm thinking.
So was your takeaway that we need to wait a couple of years, similar to the Zero Trust situation, and just see how things pan out? And in a couple of years, we'll have better AI ops the same way that now we're able to see a clearer picture around Zero Trust authentication for...
I wouldn't say people need to wait a couple of years, right? Stuff's happening now. But, when you're talking to vendors, like you're going to find them based on marketing terms. They're going to try and get you to find them based on marketing terms. Once you're actually engaged in a conversation, just try and cut through it quickly, right? So when when a company is trying to pitch AI, right, independent of the technology, what business problem are they actually helping you solve, right? And if it's a human problem, like a human analyst style problem, what is the quantifiable impact? What is the quantifiable error measure? How did they actually come up with that? What is their model training? Where is their model training coming from? Are they using a system where they even own their own intellectual property, or is it all based on either open source Creative Commons style rights or some other company's rights that maybe they don't even understand, right? It's the bar to create an interesting demo is really, really low. The bar to build a product that effectively uses a new technology to solve a business problem is not.
Sure. And that's also good advice the other way around for vendors. Like, make sure that once you're engaged in those conversations with prospects, that you are also, cutting through your own kind of marketing big words and actually telling them how we can help and how we can solve the issue. And
this is one of those things where I would just be careful, right? Your mileage may vary. Like I understand I'm somewhere in the distribution of how humans behave, but I'm probably not in the middle. When people call on me, I usually give them just a few minutes to help, where their job is to very quickly plant a flag in the map of where they live in my ecosystem. And if they can't do that, I immediately just shut them off. and move on about my day, right? And once I know where they live, then the assessment is then it becomes two things. Are they solving a problem I actually care about right now? And if the answer is no, I shut them off. If the answer is no, but I have time and there's something interesting or something compelling, then maybe I'll let them go a little bit more. Mm-hmm. But assuming they're solving something I actually care about, then I need an actual conversation about what they're doing, not the architecture, right? And it doesn't have to be an engineer from the company, but it needs to be a technically trained person who understands, what's what.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much, Jasson, for giving us your rundown of your experience at RSA and all the conversations that were going on. Fascinating. Again, this was the second one since the world shut down. And so it's kind of back into the swing of things, and it's bigger than ever, apparently. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening to this episode of Cybersecurity Hot Takes. And we will be sure to like, subscribe, share this episode everywhere. And what was Reece's phrase that she said? I
don't think you can repeat it.
Good riddance.
Yeah, good riddance indeed.